Our mission is to facilitate the emergence of new forms of collective intelligence and governance to strengthen open societies, which are essential for a civilization capable of employing and safely directing the power of exponential technologies. We are developing content to inform and empower people to help design viable future systems to progressively increase meaningful quality of life for all. This is the audible version of the articles found at consilienceproject.org. We don't make propaganda. They do. Education, propaganda, and how to tell the difference. In an information war, it is essential to be able to distinguish education from propaganda. Unfortunately, it is not always easy. Today's citizens are swamped with manipulative information, and often crave truly educational environments that they can trust. In this, the second paper of our series on information warfare, we argue that propaganda can be thought of as the evil twin of education. They often look the same, but with some careful examination, their differences become apparent. Exploring the historical dynamics of propaganda and considering its various forms helps us understand the telltale signs of coercive, manipulative, and propagandistic information. Understanding the difference between propaganda and education, and how complicated the distinction can be at times, allows for better situational awareness. Clarity about the difference allows us to protect both ourselves and our communities from being casualties of the information war. This is an essential step toward creating a healthier epistemic commons for everyone. As the information war continues to escalate, it is getting harder to create the cultural equivalent of demilitarized zones in which non-weaponized communication can take place. Education can often use the same technologies and even deliver some of the same content and ideas as propaganda. The critical difference, however, is that education is, by design and intention, non-coercive, non-manipulative, and anti-propagandistic. Like relationships between teacher and student, or parent and child, educational relationships are reciprocal and open-ended. There is a mutual interest in decreasing asymmetries of knowledge and power over time. A good teacher wants their student to be able to know the material at least as well as they do. Both parties desire graduation, or growing into maturity. Educational relationships are intrinsic to culture, civilization, and human identity. Relationships that allow for intergenerational transmission of complex skills, values, and ideas are a species-specific trait unique to Homo sapiens. They cannot benignly be replaced by propagandistic relationships or other modes of social control in which one group exercises power over another. It is not possible to graduate from a propaganda campaign into a position of knowing as much as the propagandizers. This is one of several structural differences between education and propaganda. What is propaganda? As the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, celebrates its 100th anniversary, there has been a global spectacle of related propaganda. This has included news events, political speeches, parades, and multimedia initiatives, such as those unfolding around the cinematic production of the movie 1921. The narrative recounts the history of communism in China, leaving the viewer with no sense that communism has done any wrong in Asia. It has broken box office records in China already and is being rolled out for international release. Themes raised in the movie have created a national discussion within China, a conversation the CCP is seeking to expand to the whole world. What has come to be called propaganda has a history as long as the history of civilization. The film has been called propaganda explicitly by the US media, as it sits nestled within a symbolic field of activity created around the CCP centennial celebrations. Other examples include Xi Jinping giving a speech in Tiananmen Square wearing a jacket almost identical to those worn by Mao. The US media's coverage of the CCP centennial has been controversial, because of what has been seen by some as a laudatory tone, or at least a conspicuous absence of criticism regarding the overt propaganda. But how does this CCP propaganda differ from US celebrations of national pride, such as the recent presidential inauguration, or the repeated theatrical remembrances of 1776? Why is it reasonable to label the CCP celebrations propaganda, but not similar celebrations in the United States? Within the US and other countries that hold elections, supporters of political parties will often see the other side as using propaganda to secure votes, while considering their own side as running a clean campaign. People tend to see the trusted news sources of their in-group as educational, and the other side's news sources as propaganda. What has come to be called propaganda has a history as long as the history of civilization. The term itself first appears in the heading of a 16th century papal bull critiquing Protestantism. This public decree issued by Pope Leo X accused the proponents of the Reformation of using a kind of black magic to propagate their ideas. Pope Leo X was waging a propaganda war against Luther, using the arts in particular. St. Peter's Basilica was finished as part of these efforts. Luther himself was a master propagandist. The 95 Theses can be read as exemplary propaganda. Catholic propaganda poster c. 1620, distributed in Germany and Transylvania. The images show the Prince of Transylvania, a leading Protestant, in an open-air garden castrating Jesuits. A barber approaches with shears and a measuring rod, followed by a soldier. Captions below, not pictured, explain these events to those who could read. These events never occurred. Image from Elmer Palmer, Propaganda in Germany during the 30 Years' War. During the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, tens of thousands of propaganda pamphlets and posters were printed and distributed, many of which were made up of impressive and provocative images that were aimed at the illiterate. Concepts of hell, heaven, and salvation were weaponized. Choosing sides in the ideological battle was cast by propagandists as a choice between greater or lesser forms of eternal damnation. In one poster, we see an artist's rendering of a well-known and identifiable political leader conversing with the devil, who is himself in the process of castrating monks from a nearby city. This kind of propaganda artwork had major impacts on its target populations, comprised largely of poor and illiterate peasants. For the literate and emerging bourgeois classes, on the other hand, entire books of propagandistic theology relied on the Bible and philosophy to justify total religious war. In the 17th century, we find many familiar features of modern propaganda. Posters and leaflets flooded cities and agitated urban populations into violence through coordinated mass communication. Common tactics emerged, including the propagation of fictional atrocities to demonize enemy populations. There was covert publication of forged or leaked documents with false authorship. Pandemics and the concept of the plague were used to villainize populations associated with its spread. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, religious leaders leveraged the power of the arts and theology to manipulate human emotions. But the history of propaganda began before the printing press. Monuments, murals, sculptures, architecture, coinage, and control of the written word have been a perennial means of demonstrating power and exerting political influence. Egyptian pharaohs, Ramses II and IV, and Roman emperors, Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Trajan, had complex propaganda operations as a key aspect of their governance, although they did not call them by that name. Archaeological evidence suggests these practices have occurred in all human civilizations on all continents for millennia. This use of human symbolic capacity as a means of social control at scale is distinct from, yet emergent out of, the use of spoken language to pass on skills, values, and other essential forms of knowledge and practice. 9. Using media such as sculptures, manuscripts, and symbolic events to exert political control over a large population was a fundamental innovation, which has allowed for the vast size and scope of human social coordination. 10. This innovation in propaganda coexisted with the use of those same media for the purposes of passing on, and often improving, knowledge, skills, and capacity. The race between propaganda and education determines the life course of a civilization, and importantly, the timing of its demise. So significant is the problem of propaganda that careful theoretical and scientific work has been undertaken to understand its nature and morphology, including the way it grows, evolves, and transforms as an aspect of arms races in information war. Propaganda is being defined and redefined continually as the field of information warfare evolves. Redefinitions of propaganda. A great deal depends on what is meant by the word propaganda. Institutions as divergent as the New York Times, NYT, and Fox News can both be seen as producing different kinds of propaganda. Moreover, propaganda must be understood as distinct from related phenomena, such as disinformation, conspiracy theories, fake news, and other features of our damaged information commons. Propaganda and advertising are also distinct, as we explore below. In the first piece of this series, the term irregular warfare was defined as the broadest category of strategic and tactical conflict beyond munitions and physical violence. One form of irregular warfare is information warfare, although there are also various kinds of economic and political warfare. Information warfare may be categorized further to include espionage, psychological warfare, and a whole range of various kinds of propaganda. Since the First World War, propaganda has been a field of academic study, and a range of definitions has been created. We suggest a multifaceted definition that begins with the following sentence: propaganda is any media product that has been deliberately designed and distributed by or for a political group in order to cause political action. Media products include live events, such as Xi Jinping's recent speech in Tiananmen Square, or the creation of monuments, buildings, and museums. These are created in order to be represented repeatedly through all channels of communication, including word of mouth, art, and literature. The deep history of propaganda includes, for example, ancient architectural projects seeking to evoke in subjects an embodied emotional sense that the pharaoh is a god. Political groups come in many shapes and sizes. There are small-scale propaganda campaigns seeking to influence the local school board election. There are also campaigns resulting from coordinated efforts between nation-states and international media outlets. Ancient architectural projects seeking to evoke in subjects an embodied emotional sense that the pharaoh is a god. Political groups come in many shapes and sizes. There are small-scale propaganda campaigns seeking to influence the local school board election. There are also campaigns resulting from coordinated efforts between nation-states and international media outlets, which aim to shape public opinion and behavior on a global scale. Deliberate design of propaganda has long included interdisciplinary collaboration between sciences such as psychology, sociology, and semiotics, the study of signs. More recently, this set has expanded to include neuroscience, computer sciences, data science, and memetics, the study of how memes evolve. Politically significant actions include politically relevant behavioral changes, such as voting or going to war. Changing people's ideas is a means of changing their behaviors. For the propagandists, getting someone to understand something is not an end in itself. The actions taken cannot be undone, and this binds one in unity with a group. Once you act at the bequest of propaganda, you have joined. Once you act at the bequest of propaganda, you have joined a group and are made more susceptible to future propaganda that targets its members. It should be noted that the same definition can be applied to advertising. However, in advertising the focus is on economics, not politics. Advertising is any media product that has been deliberately designed and distributed by or for an economic group, such as a company, in order to influence consumer behavior. The distinction between the economic and the political is tenuous at best, so some theorists include most forms of advertising as a subclass of propaganda. This approach is justifiable, as long as careful attention is paid to the distinction between commodity purchasing and political action as the respective goals of advertising and propaganda. Of course, education differs from both, as we discuss later in this paper. The table below presents an overview of the implications of propaganda as defined above. A feature of the many forms of propaganda is that it is possible to accuse others of using it, while at the same time denying that you are using it yourself. It is possible to switch subtly between different meanings and uses in the practice of propaganda. Our definition, in conjunction with the table below, seeks to synthesize those that have been offered in the field over many decades. Table 1, Taxonomy of Propaganda Forms. Overt propaganda looks like the famous US Army recruitment poster of Uncle Sam pointing his finger and saying, "I want you." You know its origin and its intention, and most importantly, you know it is propaganda. Consider also the messages, events, and parades, staged by governments, such as the CCP Centennial, which are all, more or less, what they appear to be. The government attempting to win over hearts and minds through careful orchestrated media events. Most citizens who attended or watched events are aware of the time and attention the government has spent to produce a moving spectacle for them. Covert propaganda does not declare itself to be propaganda. An example of covert propaganda was discussed in the first paper of the series, in the 1960s. The CIA secretly supported student groups in order to promote certain forms of ideology and protest cultures on college campuses, such as free speech, anti-war and feminism. The aim of this covert propaganda was to demonstrate that the US was an open society by promoting the visibility of dissent, highlighting the difference between America and the Soviet Union. More recently, using the new tools on social media, Russian sock puppets have disguised themselves as activists in the United States cities to spread political relevant ideas, help organize protest, and gather thousands of progressive followers on Twitter and Facebook. This is covert propaganda. You do not know it is propaganda, nor do you have any idea who is doing it or why. Deceitful propaganda overlaps with fake news, disinformation, and the worst forms of advertising. Lies have been and will always be part of propaganda, including forgeries, faked images, and flat-out falsehoods about major events. Early in the COVID-19 pandemic, thousands of Americans shared a set of radically alarmist text messages and emails, describing preparation for an imminent national lockdown to be used by Trump. The messages caused a small panic and were ultimately attributed to the activities of the Chinese intelligence agencies. Deceitful propaganda is where we get the idea of the big lie, which has been the focus of recent press attention. Tell a big enough lie enough times and it becomes the truth. Lies travel faster than truth. A host of truisms referred to the power and prevalence of deceit as an aspect of effective information warfare. Truthful but misleading propaganda represents the majority of propagandistic content in contemporary media. The Nazis flooded the German population with facts about the war that were true and likely to boost morale. What are the main techniques used by Nazi Germany during World War II was to point out to allied populations the lies told to them by their own government. The selective presentation of truths is a more promising long-term strategy than the construction of a complex network of lies. When discovered, lies can backfire dramatically and undermine all future attempts to control a target population. Propagandists make populations look for truth in one direction so that they do not have to lie about what is in the other direction. Many truths strung together can be a good way to mislead people by inferring a bigger picture that is not true. This is part of how one can lie with facts. Vertical propaganda requires the creation and distribution of media through top-down authority. The common definition of classic propaganda usually describes vertical covert deceitful propaganda. Large-scale information warfare assisted by intelligence agencies is an example of vertical propaganda. This effort involves institutions with tens of thousands of people, such as the American Information Agency and its related organizations, as built by Eisenhower during the Cold War. Troll farms in Russia are vertically organized and orchestrate their campaigns from the top down. However, the work of trolls is often aimed at creating conditions ripe for the spread of horizontal propaganda. Horizontal propaganda is distributed organically, often by members of the propagandized population themselves. Artists, writers, journalists, and everyday people start participating, replicating, and improving upon the propaganda they have been digesting. Jimi Hendrix played the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock, and what may be considered as some of the most powerful Cold War propaganda ever created. Propaganda slogans often spread like wildfire once they are placed into a culture primed for their messages. In the context of public health campaigns, many individuals will recommend actions or advice to others based on second-hand information from media articles that are actually advertisements rather than genuine healthcare guidance. Powerful symbols and memes can be invented by the very population being manipulated. A deeply propagandized population will create its own propaganda and believe it is education. Preparatory propaganda or pre-propaganda creates a culture context of symbols, language, and images that render populations amenable to propaganda campaigns. This kind of propaganda suffuses the cultural environment with the concepts and ideas necessary to support later campaigns. Preparatory propaganda can take on a life of its own through horizontal spread. Everyday consumption of news, education, and advertising creates conditions ripe for repeatedly and strategically inserting symbols, images, and ideas into the public view. Educational materials in U.S. public schools during the Cold War serve as an example of this dynamic, in which reforms in response to the launch of Sputnik impacted the psychology of nearly every child in the nation. Propaganda campaigns occur when the field of culture and meanings prepared by the pre-propaganda is catalyzed through a centralized, vertical, intervention. Campaigns do not come out of nowhere. Pre-propaganda is converted into a focused campaign seeking specific actions as outcomes. As effective as campaigns can be, it should be remembered that the general ambient environment of propagandistic symbols, images, and language is just as important in shaping moods and sentiment. These establish the potentials into which campaigns can be received. Conscious propaganda works by engaging with your existing language, images, and symbols, and you know it. This propaganda challenges or confirms your ideas, images, and thought processes, working at the level of facts, logical persuasion, and explicit arguments. Events such as the CCP Centennial or the US presidential inauguration work at the level of ideas, historical narrative, and political principles, which are explicitly stated and can be explicitly adopted as one's own views, or not. Unconscious propaganda manipulates you without you even knowing it, usually by virtue of deploying specific insights from psychology, sociology, and now neuroscience. This is most common in the contexts of preparatory propaganda. Subliminal, addictive, and catchy tactics exploit psychological weaknesses to influence unaware populations. Because this is arguably the most dangerous and least ethical form of propaganda, little is known about many of the campaigns. Project MKUltra, the secret CIA mind control program that experimented on American populations without their knowledge or consent, is perhaps the most famous example. Propaganda today. A key implication of this analysis of different types of propaganda is that modern information warfare is not primarily about spreading lies, although it certainly does involve lying in some cases. As we documented in the first paper of this series, the emerging academic field of computational propaganda is concerned with documenting and critiquing the efforts of governments and militaries who use troll armies to create disinformation environments that confuse and agitate whole populations. But that is only the most obvious form of propaganda today. Propaganda also works by means of known legacy institutions distributing many partial truths across all possible communication platforms over extended time scales, sometimes lasting decades. Modern propaganda is not primarily about manipulating people to believe sensational and foolish things. It is about playing the long game, and slowly changing people's underlying worldviews, dispositions, and habitual behaviors in the direction desired by those waging the campaign. One of the reasons for the normalization of propagandistic communication techniques is long-standing confusion about the difference between propaganda and education. Classic strategies for changing people's minds include shaping research agendas in specific sciences in particular directions. This could, for example, entail creating a specific kind of research institute tasked with asking only a certain, predefined set of questions. The results of this research are spread through multimedia advertising campaigns, frequently orchestrated by public relations firms. These firms now use experts in psychometrics to target specific ads to specific personality types based on user data lifted from social media sites. The firms collaborate with think tanks and academics to create publications, which are repackaged in relationships with the media and onto every screen. After some time, it could be months or years, large segments of the targeted population have changed basic habits and beliefs while now making choices that conform with the interests of those controlling the information environment. One of the reasons for the normalization of propagandistic communication techniques is long-standing confusion about the difference between propaganda and education. A common perspective is that the good guys use communications science to create media for information and education, while the bad guys use manipulative psychological tactics to create propaganda and lies. If the media product is created by our in-group to spread our message, then it is not propaganda, irrespective of clearly propagandistic strategies of communication. On the other hand, anything containing political ideas at odds with those of our in-group is labeled as propaganda, even if it has all the markings of good faith educational communication. It is easy to mistake the difference between propaganda and education as depending on the content of the message being conveyed, rather than the techniques, intentions, and effects of its conveyance. As all sides create propaganda of various kinds, they also accuse others of doing so and deny it themselves. In heavily propagandized environments, it can become hard to tease apart agreeable propaganda from information that is truly educational. Those seeking in good faith to serve as educators become almost impossible to distinguish from those seeking to serve as culture warriors. Between education and propaganda, the months leading up to America's entry into World War II mark another watershed in the history of propaganda. Hitler's propaganda was historically unprecedented and unmatched by his rivals. It played a large part in his early military and political successes, and eventually it reached American shores. In October of 1939, German-American Bundists held a parade on East 86th Street in New York, in which hundreds of men in brown shirt uniforms marched with American flags, alongside others bearing the red, black, and white of Nazi swastikas. Later in February that same year, 22,000 Americans rallied in Madison Square Garden to support fascism. The staging was orchestrated to look like a Nazi rally, centered around a vast portrait of George Washington, flanked by long rectangular banners bearing the stars and stripes of the US flag. All of this was of course particularly alarming to those who had come to America to escape the spread of fascist power in their own countries. Some of these émigrés and refugees were intellectuals, artists, and journalists. These groups fell into collaboration with prominent American academics and political operators. In 1941, concerns about the need to combat Nazi propaganda and prepare Americans for another world war led to the creation of the Committee for National Morale. This largely forgotten organization played an essential role in the dynamics of information warfare during both World War II and the Cold War. Committee members were all highly influential members of the American Academy and government, including the anthropologists Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, as well as psychologists Gordon Allport and Harry Stack Sullivan. Historical records, including correspondence and organizational documentation, suggest the early members of this group were operating in good faith to avoid creating a mirror image of Nazi propaganda. They feared the US could become an authoritarian regime by virtue of the structure of propagandized communication itself. Some sociologists feared that mass broadcast media such as radio and TV inevitably created authoritarian personality structures, because the rise of fascism correlated so strongly with the onset of these communications technologies. Fascists effectively used radio, TV, film, and the press to create a personality open to authoritarian control. How could those same media be used to create a personality capable of participating in democracy during wartime? Mead and Bateson explicitly characterized this problem as concerning the difference between propaganda and education. Their focus was on the structure and uses of new communication technologies as instruments of either coercion and undue influence, or as instruments of education with the potential to empower democratic citizens. They were seeking to inspire a species of scientific information management designed to simultaneously liberate and coordinate the actions of democratic selves. In such a context, leaders needed to act like educators, Bateson suggested, and they needed to teach people how to learn to learn. Mead's and Bateson's solution was to create fundamentally different kinds of media experiences, which arguably established large-scale educational campaigns that transcended the category of propaganda, at least for a brief time. They worked to create non-coercive informational and artistic events in which participants were able to gain their own impression about essential ideological issues of the day. They were not told what to think, but rather given enough information of various kinds to decide for themselves. This radically new multimedia approach would eventually be repurposed during the Cold War by Eisenhower's information warfare units, and later still by advertisement and cultural event producers. Therefore, the work of the Committee for National Morale cannot be taken as any kind of solution. Certain aspects of their work represent important forays into educational alternatives to large-scale propaganda, such as, for example, the controversial art photography exhibit, The Family of Man. The limitation of the approach adopted by the Committee on National Morale is that it was still a form of centralized technocratic control. Their methods were susceptible to co-optation and retrofitting by propagandists. People were free to explore any direction or aspect of the committee's rich multimedia exhibits and campaigns, but these experiences could only be chosen from a menu created by a small group of experts. This is sometimes called choice architecture, and it is currently used as one aspect of nudging campaigns, in which certain personal decisions are mitigated through the careful control of choice architecture in information environments and commercial interactions. An increasingly common subject for these campaigns includes the many societal challenges around public health, such as smoking and obesity. The ethics of this form of social control are contested, despite the Obama administration's major governmental initiatives towards the deployment of such strategies. Overcoming asymmetries of knowledge and power. Mead and Bateson misidentified the key issue as being about the structure of the communication environment, broadcast versus multicast, didactic versus interactive, little choice in what to watch versus lots of viewing options. These are undoubtedly important factors in shaping our engagement with the information commons. The key difference, however, is really all about the dynamics of asymmetry in information and power. What is the relationship between those who hold knowledge and those who are in need of it? Is there an unbridgeable knowledge gap, by design, or is there a path toward mutual responsibility for the total range of knowledge, i.e., graduation? Both propaganda and education involve the deliberate design of informational environments, for the purposes of emotional engagement, behavior change, and the learning of specific ideas. As we have seen, propaganda acts ultimately in the interest of powers held by a political group. Education, however, acts in the interest of reducing the difference in power between those in the know and those who need to learn. Educators are interested in securing a successful transmission between generations and classes of shared responsibility for the social system. True educators are not interested in solidifying political power and administering social control through the use of information and its strategic communication. Educational relationships always involve a situation of legitimate epistemic asymmetry. The teacher knows more than the student, and this is known and embraced by both parties. Educational media and practices, in schools and beyond, seek to lessen and eventually make obsolete the very asymmetry upon which the relationship is based. The goal is that the student graduates and does not need to be dependent upon a specific source of epistemic authority. They become one themselves. This means the educator is radically accountable and responsible for what they say and do because they are in a position that is by design creating an eventual peer, someone who can fully check and evaluate their work. Groups seeking to educate whole populations on how to think and act need to take steps that show they are accountable for the impact of their influence. Propaganda also usually involves an epistemic asymmetry. The propagandists know more than the propagandized, or at least act on that assumption. Propaganda works to maintain and widen the asymmetries of power and knowledge that make propaganda possible and apparently necessary. This is because the goal is to exercise control over the behavior of target populations, not to help them expand the range of their behavior into realms occupied by the propagandists, such as the realms of deciding what is true and false. As such, the propagandists, by design, cannot be held accountable for the content of their communications because they have disallowed the possibility. The propagandists' complete sources and data are simply never made accessible to the propagandized. A good teacher, though, will consider exactly the same text as their student and aim to pass on the responsibility for understanding all of the data and more. The contrast here is clear, but in practice it can be hard to detect. A clear example can be drawn from the pharmaceutical industry. Drug companies have been known to conduct large-scale public health campaigns to convince people that a drug is safe, despite never revealing all the data necessary to evaluate safety comprehensively. In such cases, the information campaign is designed to influence behavior towards taking the drug, rather than to educate earnestly about the nature of the drug and the research behind it. To be even more specific, in COVID-19 vaccination public health campaigns, there are at least two pieces of uncontested, though rarely stated, information that tip the balance away from education and towards propaganda. The first is that the raw data held by pharmaceutical companies is not available to anyone but them. Nor should it be, under current legal standards of practice for drug research. Nevertheless, this creates an unbridgeable epistemic asymmetry, and one that is actively guarded against breach. The second is that vaccine manufacturers are not accountable for the failure of the vaccine to work or for the injuries caused by the vaccine. And again, according to the letter of the law, they are not required. However, this creates an anti-educational relationship between the company and its customers. How trustworthy can a teacher be who will not seek to be held accountable for their claims and recommendations? No teacher would do that, only a salesman would have that kind of fine print. Groups seeking to educate whole populations on how to think and act need to take steps that show they are accountable for the impact of their influence. Not doing so undermines the possibility of learning because it generates a fundamental distrust. If unbridgeable epistemic asymmetries are established and maintained, while accountability is avoided, then it is hard not to receive the label of propaganda and deserve it. Recent research shows that the most highly educated, those holding PhDs, are the most hesitant to take COVID-19 vaccines. The least educated are also among the most hesitant, although they are more likely to change their minds. At least part of the explanation for these findings are the discernible dysfunctions and unbridgeable epistemic asymmetries involved in public discourse about the vaccine. Only a few extra questions reveal that the possibilities for education are overrun by powerful propaganda. It is not a question of who presents facts. It is a question of who presents enough total information, alongside evidence of good faith and clarity of presentation, to allow a motivated and reasonable person to become truly educated about the topic. Is the creator of the message relating to us in good faith as potential students and collaborators, or in bad faith as if we are part of a target population to be manipulated? Although this is often difficult to establish, on occasion it can be crystal clear, particularly in the case of micro-targeted advertisements and public service announcements appearing in a social media news feed. Some want to build rubrics, checklists, and other analytical tools to empower citizens. The problem with simple propaganda analysis tools is that they can't keep up with the arms races taking place at the frontiers of information warfare. Moreover, once such a tool has been created, a sophisticated propagandist could use it as an objective reference to prove their work can be trusted. This kind of certification of official truth is part of the problem, and often functions as covert propaganda. Indeed, the work of the Consilience Project risks being labeled as covert propaganda precisely because it claims to offer content that is only educational. Isn't this exactly what good propaganda would claim? Isn't this content propaganda too, especially because it is claiming not to be? These kinds of questions form a vicious cycle of epistemic suspicion, a form of epistemic nihilism, and removes the possibility for education to occur. It makes the mistake of assuming that there is no point in even trying to distinguish between education and propaganda. A cultural mood of epistemic nihilism is the fallout of information war. It leads to an inability to orient toward legitimate epistemic asymmetries. The end result is a breakdown of educational cooperation between generations. Over time, epistemic suspicion systematically distorts educational exchange between generations and between parts of society with access to different levels of information. Our recommendations here are based upon principled commitments, rather than concrete prescriptions, diagnostic techniques, or media literacy rubrics. All these measures are important and remain the focus of effort and inquiry by others. In our paper on the challenges of making sense of the 21st century, we discussed the need for a new ethos of learning and a new emotional stance of epistemic humility. For these kinds of principled values to manifest, there must also emerge new practices and cultural habits, and likely new kinds of institutions. In the first paper of this series, we offered the idea of combat-free zones or demilitarized zones, educational refuges in the context of a total and escalating information war. This is where the weapons of the culture war could be laid down so that a different form of communication could take place. However, only a prior shared commitment to an ethos of learning can enable this kind of ceasefire. The epistemic hubris and nihilism resulting from propaganda must be replaced by the good faith questioning and epistemic humility that drive cooperative educational engagements. We know already the catastrophic outcomes of mismanaged educational crises, and the dire consequences for open societies in particular. It is clear that one of the main challenges to securing viable futures for open societies is limiting the range of propagandistic communication. If we let propaganda continue to dominate and shape our information commons, the future will be determined by an ever smaller group of powerful interests. In that scenario, eventually it is everyone who bears the catastrophic cost of humanity's self-imposed inability to make sense of the world.